The midterms are over, and I would say that we can all sigh a sigh of relief, except that we know that they're basically going to start campaigning for 2020 almost immediately, and we can expect the same thing, if not worse, to play out. It's just going to be more violent rhetoric and more clashes, more neighbor turning against neighbor. But how do we, at this point, avoid such division in politics? It's pretty clear at this point that the major political parties aren't going to suddenly compromise, come together, and sing kumbaya. And even when the right side, whichever side that may be, wins the election, then they're still making half the country quite unhappy with what they're going to do. I really think it's time we start taking secession seriously. Now, secession obviously brings up some negative images, civil war, that whole kerfuffle. The real question is, why are we sticking in a union where all the parties don't agree? Why are we forcing ourselves into the situation that is going to cause conflict? Because all 320 million of us Americans being in this same country called the United States is at this point only causing conflict because we obviously cannot agree on how the country should be governed. But the great thing about the United States is that we actually have 50 different governments sitting there, lying in wait, just ready to be independent countries. If the United States government disappeared tomorrow, it would not be a disaster. 50 governments would continue functioning and there would be no power vacuum. It really wouldn't be a big problem. There would be a lot of reorganization to take place. There's over 2 million federal employees. Currency would have to be figured out. But these are problems that could be solved in the states. This doesn't have to be ideological. This makes sense on both sides of the aisle. We agree to go our separate ways. This is the most peaceful possible outcome for our country at this point. To say, look, we're not getting anything done. We're not agreeing on a lot of the things that we should be agreeing on. Let's just agree to disagree, go our separate ways, stop trying to force our method of governing on the other side, and maybe we'll actually see some governments that reflect what the people actually want. That is far more peaceful than staying in this cycle where every 2 years we're at each other's throats, accusing one side of being white supremacists and the other side of trying to tear it all down and throw us in the gulag. Just stop. Are we going to have some of those same battles at the state level? Probably, but it's going to be smaller. It's going to be more representative of us. We'll be voting for state representative and state senate. When you bring these races closer to home, when they're smaller, your vote actually counts for more. It's a smaller pool of voters, so your vote as a percentage of the outcome is larger. You have more voice in government. You also live down the street from your state rep. You live down the street from your state senator. When they're embedded in that community, they know that the reverberations of what they do could come back to them a lot quicker. It cuts down on corruption as well. People aren't flying 3,000 miles away to hobnob with lobbyists. Instead, they're in your home state. Now, I realize some states are still pretty big and you'd still have some of these issues, but it would be better. It would be an improvement. And if it was an improvement, again, you could exit. So what would we see? We would see a real choice in different governments that we could move to quite easily. It's unlikely that a lot of states would enact strict border controls and not allow citizens from other states to move in. It just wouldn't benefit them because they would be competing with other states. They'd be competing with other states for residents. They'd be competing for business, for capital, basically for money, for tax revenue. And the stronger the economy, the more high-quality jobs, high-quality industries, and intelligent, well-educated citizens, the better those states are going to be doing. But we don't really have to decide how it would all go down because the market would tell us. And that would be the biggest benefit of there being 50 independent nations where the 50 states currently stand. There would be competition among these governments, and the people would tell them exactly what they valued and what they don't value. Look, it's easy to move from state to state. I moved 1,400 miles from Massachusetts to Florida, And what did I get? I got lower taxes. There's no income tax. I can now shoot guns in my backyard if that's something you're into. In general, there's less regulation. It's a little bit closer to the idea of how I want a government to look. In fact, that's one of the things that probably made Europe such a economic powerhouse to begin with. The competition among the kingdoms meant that when there was a new invention or a new innovation, neighboring kingdoms had to adopt it, or they would be outcompeted by their competitors just a few miles away. Contrast that with the Ottoman Empire, who actually outlawed the printing press. Guess who was more literate? The printing press handed the power of knowledge back to the people. It's competition among countries that allow that sort of innovation. It's competition among companies that allow that sort of innovation. So now we're well beyond the printing press. We have the internet. And the internet has made big centralized governments less necessary than ever before. We can communicate. We don't really need the postal service. We can see what's happening in other places of the world. We can talk to people from across the world. We can conduct business online. We have the tools for regulation at our fingertips. There's reviews. There's a lot more transparency. And these innovations are more likely to happen when countries are competing with each other. But unfortunately, the federal government followed me down to Florida. And I still have to pay federal income taxes. I still have to comply with all the federal regulations and laws. Florida can't offer me a product that is that different than Massachusetts. They can offer me certain benefits at the state level, but they can't offer me all the benefits that an independent nation could. And why not, really? That's the question. It's not like any state in the United States is too small to be an independent country. In fact, if Florida was its own country, it would have the 17th largest economy on Earth. Florida has millions more residents than Chile or the Netherlands. Its GDP tops $1 trillion a year. That's bigger than Turkey's economy, even though Florida only has about a quarter of the population of Turkey. So it's actually would be doing pretty well on its own as its own independent country. With just under 21 million inhabitants, it would be the 58th largest country on Earth. And other states hold up pretty similarly. In fact, if California was its own country, it would be the 5th largest economy in the entire world. Its population is much higher than Canada, Saudi Arabia, and Poland, and only slightly smaller than Spain, Argentina, and Ukraine. California would have the 5th largest economy in the world, bigger than Great Britain's, despite being only 2/3 of the population of Great Britain. I can go on. There's plenty of other states that New York would be the 59th largest by population with the 15th largest economy. And what these states have in common is that they're actually net neutral or net payer states to the federal government. What that means is that these states, California, Florida, Texas, New Hampshire, they pay more to the federal government, to Washington, D.C., than they get back in various programs. So more money is leaving the state than is coming back. Well, why would you want to stay in that situation? If you're a state large enough to be its own independent state with a strong economy, why would you want to fund other states? It doesn't make much sense. It makes even less sense for certain states like California, who is a net payer, when that money is redistributed to states like Alabama, which is a net taker of federal money. And I would say that I don't think a lot of Californians agree with a lot of Alabamians about how the country should be run. But California supports these states that hate California. Let's get back to the whole competition thing. States would compete in different areas. They would compete to have better laws and regulations. Right now, we can shout at the federal level about what's a fair minimum wage and what's a fair regulatory environment and how high taxes should be on corporations. But instead of just arguing about it and letting the government sway back and forth and having any gains reverted back to the old way, why not have 50 independent countries set their own policies and then judge the success by the economy and by how that country performs. That's not such a crazy idea. Then when I moved to Florida from Massachusetts, I would be voting with my feet. I would be throwing my support behind a government that better matches what I want from a government. It would be a true voice of the people instead of this vote, which doesn't seem to make much difference. There's two things going on here. There's the voice. You need the voice in government. That's the vote. But you also need the ability to exit. You need to be able to withdraw your support from that government. If we had 50 countries where the states now stand, that would be easy. You simply move over the border. Now you might be saying, well, if you hate this country so much, why don't you move out? It's really not that easy. First of all, this is a very large country with a large population. I would have to go more than 1,400 miles if I wanted to move out. Second of all, there are only about 195 countries on Earth, many of which aren't actually a choice at all, and many of which are a bad choice. Furthermore, you actually can't just move outside of the United States and cut ties with it. You have to renounce your citizenship. And if you renounce your citizenship, there's an exit tax. They tax you like you liquidated your entire wealth, as if you sold everything, capital gains, etc. You're getting taxed on that. Okay, so go ahead and exit, but we'll rob you at the door. So if we have 50 states, no longer a serious problem. It's a lot easier to move to another neighboring English-speaking state than it is to move abroad. And again, this would be another realm of competition. How easy is it to move to another state and get residency and citizenship or just work there without having to get citizenship? This would all be decided through the market competition among states, attracting businesses and people. If you want to live in a state with high taxes, go to California. If you want to live in a state with low taxes, come to Florida. If you want to live in a state with legalized marijuana, we'll start seeing that those states are doing better in their economies than the states that haven't legalized it. But there's 50 choices here, and there will be plenty of choices. The only reason for states to start adopting the other policies of the other states is if they're successful, if people like them, and then they're competing to bring those same sorts of residents and wealth to that state. Somebody floated the idea that even if California did secede, they would still contract with the federal government for military in exchange for keeping the bases there and maybe paying some taxes. This would actually still be a better organization than the way we currently have it. If the states could secede and then contract with DC for their military power, this would actually restore some control over military spending, and what exactly the military does. Why would, for instance, California agree to sending money and troops to go invade a country in the Middle East? That doesn't really make much sense for the citizens of California. Now, it didn't really make much sense for the citizens of the United States either, but it still happened. So what we would have is a little bit more separation of power. If California didn't like that idea, they could say, well, you know what, we're not going to contract you with the military anymore, and it would automatically defund whatever percentage California contributed to the military. I see this as a much more likely scenario of defunding the military based on, as opposed to current methods. Clearly, the legislature isn't going to do that. And before you get me wrong, I'm not saying that you never need a military necessarily. I'm simply saying that America's military is already bigger than the next 10 militaries combined. We could cut it in half and still be larger than China's, Russia's, and Saudi Arabia. There's trillions of dollars that they've actually spent that they can't account for. They just can't show us the receipts. So clearly, giving the states a little bit more control to say, yeah, we're not going to fund that, we're not going to send you soldiers for that, would be an option. The states could contract with the federal government for other things as well, or they could not. Again, this would be a competition, and it would actually give the federal centralized government the opportunity to compete in this marketplace as well. Is there some reason why we need a union of states to better fulfill some function of a government? If so, perhaps those contracts will be carried out by the federal government with the state's approval. And right now, that's not happening. We could get into the 17th Amendment, which was senators used to be elected by state legislatures. That way, the actual state government had representation in Congress. Don't want to get into that right now. Let me know if you want a different video on that. But basically, it would restore states' control. You could see coalitions of other states, and these could be loose or tight coalitions. For example, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, if they want to go and start a new country, Acadia, they could do that. But it could be as loose or as tight of a coalition as they want. It could be just for military. It could be an open borders agreement. It could be a tax treaty. It could be no tariffs. Again, it's left up to competition. We would all individually have more control over how this system would play out because we'd be influencing the positions of our states. But what I would love to see is more and more countries every year. Why not? As soon as the larger body doesn't represent the needs of a smaller segment of that country, why shouldn't that segment be allowed to break off and go their separate ways? They're not hurting anybody, and that's the thing. Look, democracy isn't perfect, obviously. When we're put into this big group and the majority gets to decide what happens to everybody, all you need is 51%, and then the other 49% can be consistently oppressed and ignored. Literally, that's what democracy is. It's mob rule. It's the majority deciding what will happen for everybody. The minority doesn't have a voice. That minority could be a racial minority, it could be an ethnic minority, or it could be the minority of businessmen or a minority of individuals. An individual is a minority who might not be represented. Let's take California as an example again. You have the United States, and California voters decide that they want to go their separate way. So, of course, that smaller piece of the country should be able to break off and govern itself based on consent of the governed. If that majority in a smaller section decides that they want to form their own country, let them. But then if Northern California, if some segment of California decides that they want to govern themselves and we're still going to go with this majority rules sort of thing, why shouldn't they be able to break off from California? But then, say there's a town in Northern California that says, well, now this place isn't really representing our needs. We're going to break off from that. Really, if there's not a consensus, you should be able to go your separate ways. That's being in voluntary consensual relationships. You shouldn't be forced to be in a group that you don't want to be a part of, and you shouldn't be allowed to force other people to be a part of a group that they don't want to be a part of. It's pretty basic stuff that we should have learned in kindergarten. Look, the way I see it is there's only 195 countries on Earth. There's that many fast food restaurants within 10 miles of my house. But here's the thing. I don't eat fast food. I don't want to go to any of those fast food restaurants. I want to grow my own food, and I do. I want to go to the farmer's market, pick out all organic, healthful ingredients. I want to come home and I want to make my own meal based on my own design. I don't want to pick off the menu. I don't want to pick from a crappy fast food place. That's basically what this would do. It would give us more choices to build our own meal, to design our own menu item instead of having to choose from the limited choices that we're handed currently. And yet here we are forcing 320 million people to get along. But we're not getting along, and we're not going to get along, and we should just go our separate ways, and that will allow us to get along. When we're not all pooled into this group of 320 million people and said, well, you all have to decide on how we're going to govern the country. That's silly. We'll get along better when we go our separate ways. It'll be more peaceful when we're not at each other's throats trying to force our agenda. That's why we need secession. And all we basically need for this is to make sure that the federal government doesn't come in guns blazing and say, nope, you're going to fund us whether you like it or not. I hope that in this day and age, if there was popular support, they wouldn't be able to do that. And there's something to suggest that they wouldn't react violently. After all, in the end, the USSR did fall peacefully. It was after a lot of violence before that, in the decades leading up to it, the whole century basically. But eventually, when the USSR, the United Soviet Socialist Republic, did disband, it did so peacefully. And now if you look at some of those countries that were in the bloc, like Estonia is a great example, Lithuania, they're actually doing really well. Georgia, the country, is actually a great example. Georgia now has an easy visa process. You can travel to the country of Georgia, south of Russia, and you can stay for up to a year if you're from one of 90 different countries, and you don't need you can work, you can study, you can invest and you don't need any special kind of visa. You can also open a bank account in Georgia if you're a foreigner. And again, really easy to do. That gives you a little bit of an option. It lets you diversify. And these are small examples of competition among states. Estonia has started an e-citizenship program. Now, right now, it's not full-fledged citizenship. They created a product before they were sure that they had a market for that product. So now they're allowing the market to shape that product. So right now it gives you an online identification, so it's easier to do business in the European Union. They're actually talking about starting a cryptocurrency as well, a token that could be used on the platform among those businesses with e-citizenship, and then they can trade the token for their services. So creating an online economy and community. There's so much information to cover here. I could talk for an hour alone about Estonia, but the point being that they're innovating. They're offering a new product to people as a government, and they're seeing that people are coming to them to get that product even in its beginning stages before it's really that useful, because they're so excited by the prospect of being offered a different type of government, of being able to choose their government, of being able to influence how that government serves them. And that's the whole point, that governments are meant to serve people. If they're not serving people, they shouldn't exist. And that is why we need competition among these governments, so that we actually have an option when we don't feel represented by the government that we're currently a part of. Now, of course, it's a whole nother question. How do you do that? Do you do a ballot initiative? Do you elect the right people to get in there? I'm not going to pretend to know that. I think there's also tons of room for individual action where it doesn't have to be done through the legislature. But what we need to start is this dialogue so that people don't feel they can come back to me if I secede and drag me back into their club. We don't need another civil war. We don't need the federal government saying, no, you cannot leave this union. You will be forced at gunpoint to stay in it, to fund it, and to live by the laws that Washington, D.C. hands down. So that's my take on secession. Why don't you go ahead and comment with your thoughts. Let me know anything I missed, and let me know anything that you want me to address in a future video on the same or similar topic. Why don't you go ahead and subscribe? There'll be a lot more content like this. Click the subscribe button down there and click the little bell so that you'll get a notification when I post another video. I'm Joe Jarvis, and thanks for watching. I appreciate it.